I hope everybody has had a chance to stretch and grab something to eat and move away from the screen if that's needed, as it is often needed for most of us. We're going to move on with our program today, our program of storying science, very situated science, with next story number 5, which is Susan Douglas leading us through iron working, technology, and history. Thank you, Susan.
Okay, I should be sharing my screen now, I hope. Can you confirm?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. So this again is a PowerPoint that has all the links in it that you need. And it occurred to me, of course, when we teach about the metals, we sort of go through, the Stone Age and then the beginning of copper technology and the Bronze Age and so on into iron. But students wouldn't necessarily realize why that was, that there was a sequence of metals being used and why people could use, for example, gold before all of those other ones, because it occurs in nuggets and it doesn't need to be melted down necessarily in this way. So this is a PowerPoint I used with my World History STEAM Plus, again with humanities added. And let me see if I can make it advance properly. There we go. I'm starting out with a verse from the Quran, which actually describes the revelation that human beings learned how to forge iron, to make use of iron. The surah, this chapter of the Quran is actually named Iron. The scientific side of the story starts with the melting points of metals, why humans, quote unquote, graduated to using iron after other metals. It's pretty simple laid out here. The melting points of we'll use Celsius here for universality, of tin, lead, you can see them going up, bronze, which is a mixture of copper and tin. And you see it going up to silver, is quite higher. Again, sometimes occurs in nugget form in nature, so it's not as hard to just to smelt. Gold has a high melting point, but again, it occurs as nuggets they've gathered out of river and so on. Copper was one of the first metals to be smelted, and again, there was an advance to that. But when you get to iron, look at the jump here that happens. You have cast iron, which is the most simple one to pour it into a mold after it has been extracted from the ore, and you go all the way up to carbon steel, which has way, way higher melting points. So I want to show you a brief clip. I have to go out of this for a second and go to the video, which I will bring up here, just a few seconds of it, and then go back to another one. So I should be sharing my sound. Tell me if I'm not, Elsa. Hold on one second.
Smaller till we get to the top.
We can hear it.
It's about 1 inch thick at the top of the furnace. So before we can use that furnace, we have to drive out all the moisture out.
Okay, hold on one second. That actually advanced a little bit too far. This is her talking about the first ways of iron being discovered.
Ornamental ironwork called clay and steel. So when we
Sorry for the glitch here. The reason that this is happening is because there was a set of advertisements here. So how did people discover iron?
Forged was found on the ground, and they would find it in the form of meteorites. In Egypt, in King Tut's tomb, they found an iron dagger that was found alongside a solid gold dagger, and it was believed that the iron dagger was valued just as highly as the solid gold dagger because iron was so rare. My name is Celeste Flores. I'm an instructor at the Crucible in blacksmithing, and I have a business doing ornamental ironwork called Clay and Steel.
Okay, so that particular video takes us to the idea of how iron was first found. It was found either in the form of iron ore, which was very much mixed with rock and needed those high temperatures. And then it occurred in its natural form, like gold, and in some cases silver and copper did, as meteorites, which of course they would say it came from the sky. Well, guess what? It did. But they were able to actually use this more purified form of iron already crystallized by heating and hammering it. So the two different ways of describing iron work is forged iron, which is beaten, and cast iron, which is liquefied and then poured. So I'm going to continue here in this mode. I have another short clip here. This is inventing furnaces to smelt iron. I wanted to show my students, how can you make such a forge? We would be able to, show them pictures of modern steel industries with big factories and all these kinds of things. But here we're trying to get to where they would see how human beings could have quite early on with natural materials have come up with something like this. And I hope this will now run. Wait, forging, let me see. Yes. Okay, this is the one I want to run. And it should go quickly, I hope, and not interrupt.
Last year, we had such a great time. We took our guys from Bamba Forge on a road trip to a small village in the mountains of Uganda where there were several older traditional blacksmiths who were in their 70s and 80s. These guys remembered when they were little boys working with their fathers and grandfathers to smelt this local iron ore in handmade cupolas into iron and steel. This is the kind of cupola they made, just made out of clay. And then these bellows were goat skin, and they used some plastic too. And they would pump these after the fire was started, burning a mixture of charcoal and iron ore inside of this cupola to produce steel. It was a lot of fun. We got to pump the bellows, and these guys worked all day and all night. And the next morning, it was time to open up the cupola and see what the results were. Wow. We were really excited about the success of this smelt. Big pieces of the bloom were very, very magnetic, and they were amalgamated with a bunch of stuff, but we were able to forge a piece out in Uganda, and our guys at Bamba Forge forged this little knife.
Okay, let's see, let me run that just a tiny bit longer. No, okay. It just shows that it's happening in Kenya. I'm going to go back out here and continue so we don't exceed our 5 minutes here. But the next part of this lesson is some references to some materials out there on the internet. Striking Iron, The Art of African Blacksmiths, some articles and some videos are part of that. And then here is the science lesson again for exposure, not mastery, where we are showing students how this thing which they've just seen coming out of this forge, what they had made was a smelting furnace, a bloomery. It has a pit or a chimney, so you have to control fire and sustain it. They said it took all day and all night to pump those bellows. And then it's only made, however, of clay or stone or any other source of that kind of material. So near the bottom, they showed the pipes out of clay or metal to allow air to enter the sidewalls of the oven. Clay pipes are perfectly acceptable. Either natural airflow or bellows made of leather and wood forces air into the furnace to bring up that temperature in a closed space. In the absence of that oxygen, it wouldn't work, that extra oxygenation. The next is, of course, to burn wood to make charcoal, which is pure carbon, makes the hottest possible fire, but it will also combine with the iron as it comes out of the bloomery to add carbon, which hardens the iron. So again, before the ore is put in, it is broken into small pieces and roasted in the fire. So here is what it looks like. You just saw it in the video, making the bloom, which is made up of iron, iron plus slag, which is the waste. And then how it's done, again, it describes it here. Inside the furnace, carbon monoxide from incomplete burning turns the iron oxides into metallic iron, so it doesn't need to reach the full melting temperature of the ore. What's left over are these impurities. They fall to the bottom. The bloom falls to the bottom of the furnace and forms a spongy mass, which is porous and full of holes and is not yet pure iron. So moving along here again, there are going to be more videos that do this at greater length in different locations in Africa. But again, following through on the story of how this happens, taking from that forge, as you saw in the last frame or so of the last video, the people had made a steel knife out of it. Okay, so this is now the bloom, purified, heated in the presence of carbon, and then beaten with a hammer to take those impurities out. Again, more control of temperature, more bringing the fire under control into it during the forging process. So this is the second stage after extracting it from the ore. And in order to make this usable, it's reheated and beaten, reheated and beaten, and there are many examples of this. So these are the kinds of tools that can be made out of it. These happen to be artifacts that are in various museums. And the last slide I have for you here is, again, a resource. Let me see if I can get past it. Come on. Apparently it's not yet in this version somehow. Anyway, I do have it. If I can move back to the PowerPoint, where I have a large selection of videos. No, I don't. Apparently that's not in a different version, but I promise you that I will bring that out. I'll stop sharing now. That took a little bit longer, and I'm sorry the tech was a little bit more complex, but all of the materials will be available in the resource file, because there are some really interesting long videos, which of course I couldn't share with you, of different kinds of forging of ore ovens that were made. Also, of pretty long videos that show the entire process of it, including the cultural context of people visiting, and also in West Africa, with some of the very amazing videos that Christopher Roy has made for ceramic processes and iron processes and others, in which he really records beautifully the cultural context, the music that is played while this forging process of over a day and a night, and collecting the materials by everybody around is laid out, and the real artistry of the ovens as well is fascinating to watch. So I will retrieve that from wherever that last slide went, but I did quite a bit of research on articles there that would winnow out those films for you. So thank you very much, and let's go on to our next story.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Susan. And again, somebody mentioned the Smithsonian Museum of African Art in DC. That is a wonderful resource for that. I think it's worth teaching about the UNESCO World Heritage Sites on iron in Burkina Faso that date back to 8th century before Common Era, that really also show not only the innovative technologies, but also the climate change, and the way that forested area of West Africa and the Sahel used to be used for, was much more forested than it is today. So we're going to move on to our next story, and Tiffany is going to share the screen. This is a story that's going to connect very well from what Joy was talking about, seeing students represented in the curriculum, to our next speaker, Emily Williamson Ibrahim, who will share about children's place-making and place-based meaning making around place.
Hi, my name's Seth Pruitt. I'm 14 and I live in Nairobi, Kenya. And in 2019, I went to a coding camp because I'm very into computers and coding and video production. So I went to a coding camp, and there I was approached by a company that wanted to produce a science show based in Nairobi to talk about science and also incorporate Africa within it. And so they approached me and asked me if I wanted to be part of this project, and I said yeah. And so when I got home from the camp, I immediately made my own set, set up my own cameras and audio, and I made my own audition. I even set up the science experiment and edited it, and I sent it to them.
Today I'm going to show you how to write a secret message. What you're going to need is a tablespoon of baking soda, 2 tablespoons of water, 2 mixing cups, food coloring, 2 paintbrushes, and a piece of paper.
And within a few hours I had gotten the job, and so there began my journey of Super Sema and Sema's Lab. The show was called Sema's Lab, but Super Sema was the overall universe of this Sema's Lab. Sema is an African girl who is also a superhero, and so this Sema's Lab was supposed to be her way of showing how to do these science experiments, but with real life actors. So while shooting the show, I was able to pick up a bunch of new skills and things I just didn't know that I was curious about before. I got to see how they started recording, how they recorded audio, and just film production in general. And that was a really interesting thing that I was able to learn and pick up from filming. And yeah, and generally filming the episodes, I learned a lot about science that I didn't know before. And I just had fun, and I made a lot of friends too from it. So we released the show on a bunch of TV channels, YouTube, and all these different platforms. And in a very short time, it gained a lot of views and a very supportive audience that loved watching them. And generally, I would go out somewhere to like a library or something, and someone would be like, "Oh my gosh, that's Seth from the show." And they would tell me how they want to make videos with me eventually, and like how much it inspired them. And that was a really cool thing to hear, that my simple science could inspire tons of kids in Africa. And yeah, I really enjoyed that.
Thank you very much, Seth, who is not able to join us today, but it is really wonderful to see this kind of leadership of students embedded in their passion about making sense of their worlds and having fun. I just linked the Semes Lab show as well, which is a really nice complement to the Engine show as well that features Seth. Emily is a graduate student at Boston University, a PhD candidate in anthropology, and her research focuses on proverbial sayings called folded speech in Hausa. And that offers a lens through which to understand how people manage structural uncertainty among Zongos, the name used to describe predominantly Muslim urban settlements in Ghana, West Africa. Emily is such a broad and amazing, broad-based person, but has a Master's of Science in Architectural Studies from MIT, and an undergraduate degree from Art History from Colby. And you've also worked as an architect in Washington, D.C. and collaborated on cultural heritage projects in Ghana, taught landscape architecture at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, and is a co-founder of the amazing nonprofit, the Zongo Stories Project, which I mentioned earlier as the event started, and I'm mentioning again the links to which are on our resource list. And so what better person to end our day today with this combination of understanding of place, environmental science, engagement of children than Emily. So thank you. It's an honor to have you here, Emily. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Elsa, for that very generous introduction. I am going to share my screen. Okay, and okay. Can everyone see the screen? Sorry, with a PDF, it takes a little bit of
Yes.
In and out work there. Okay, but everyone can see it okay. So it's an absolute pleasure to be with you here today. Elsa, you did such a wonderful job introducing me. I feel like I can skip the first, 15 slides or so, but maybe I'll just repeat it in a slightly different way. But anyway, it's a joy to be with you. And the title of my talk today is "We Are All Ears: Storytelling Science and a Sense of Place in Ghana, West Africa." So here we go. Okay, so actually what I would love to do first is my presentation. I'm sure you've all done a lot of listening today, a lot of listening to wonderful stories and other presentations. And I thought it would be nice to actually have a not frightening interaction, but calming interaction and kind of meditative interaction. So if you could pull out a piece of paper and a pen, or if those things are too old-fashioned for you, feel free to use the chat. And again, this is not something that you need to share with everyone. I realize that some of us are more comfortable sharing in classroom spaces than others. And I, for one, am one of those who doesn't necessarily like to share right off the bat. So if you want, though, feel free to put your responses in the chat as I ask questions throughout my presentation, or you can just jot down some ideas on a piece of paper, whatever is most comfortable for you. Okay, so again, so my name is Emily Williamson Ibrahim. I am a candidate in sociocultural anthropology at Boston University. And as Elsa mentioned, I have been going to and from West Africa for much of my life. I think it's been almost 20 years now, which is wild, mostly from New England, which you can see here. So this is my hometown of Hanover, New Hampshire, and very quiet, cold, spent much of my childhood running around in the woods. And then somehow I found myself here. This is the capital of Ghana, called Accra. And you can tell, I mean, I wish we could all be instantly transported there right now, because you would just hear all of these vibrant noises, horns honking, brushing up against people. You know, we'd probably all be hot and sweaty. And but anyway, I just wanted to sort of introduce myself through these two very different versions of places that have become a deep part of my own sense of place in the world. And then again, as Elsa mentioned, I have a kind of a diverse sort of, you know, not a very straightforward background in architecture and design, cultural geography, anthropology, art, and storytelling. But I do bring all of these different ideas together in a place in West Africa, and working among places called Zongos, which is the Hausa name for a stranger settlement or kind of traveler's camp. And so historically, people have traveled all over West Africa, moving from one of these Zongos to another. They are predominantly Islamic. And usually there's one major Zongo in every single major city in West Africa. So you can see, and they're called different things. They're not always called Zongos. But you can see here, all of those little black dots are Zongos. And so most of my research, my teaching, my nonprofit work has all centered around Zongos, and just been fascinated in the ways these diverse communities really come together. They're very, very mobile, so people are constantly coming and going. They're very diverse, different beliefs, values, practices, all kind of coming together in this one place. So you can see, even just from a few of these quotes from community members, how very diverse this place is, right? Like Nima, which is one of the Zongos that I work in, someone said, you know, it's a whole world in one place. Or this is a place that's, you know, an elephant's stomach. It has everything inside. So that has long fascinated me. And so I've been really interested throughout all of my research in the relationship between place and meaning, and how we kind of are reflections of the places that we inhabit, and how we create deep meanings out of them, and how important that is in our teaching and our research. And so I explore this through kind of two different lenses. One is through experience, so our sense of place, and that, you know, there's not necessarily a word for that, right? Like when you're experiencing a place, it's all of your senses, all of your being are so part of that place that it's inextricable, right? You can't necessarily put words to it. But then we also reflect upon these places, and we reflect upon these places that we inhabit in a really deep way, often through narrative, through storytelling. I also, in my research, look at it through poetry, through words, through social media, and through incredible drawings or paintings like this one from West Africa. Okay. But I'm sure you're all wondering kind of, so what? Where am I taking you with all of my background and these ideas about sense of place? But really, I'm interested in how we can apply these ideas to our teaching practice, and through two different layers. So first, through this questions about senses of place. So how might we be thinking about how sense of place can be useful in our teaching? So how do our attachments to places, how can we create a more sort of meaningful learning environment for students because of that? And then a second layer of this is engaging in storytelling. And so thinking about building on the sense of place, how do we kind of create meaning out of these places using stories? And how might we actually center the story as a vital tool in our classroom? Okay, so how are we going to do this? I decided, because there is not nearly as much time as I wanted to, and actually my husband this morning, he said, oh, just tell them you're doing a tiny, tiny little piece of your research because you can't incorporate it all. So I'm saying his 2 cents. But I thought the quickest and maybe most easiest way to grasp a lot of this is through this book that I wrote and illustrated with students in Ghana called Gizo Gizo, A Tale from the Zongo Lagoon. So we will be kind of revisiting that here and there to kind of help ground us, help moor us to these questions. Okay, so first, if you have that, pen and paper, or, if you want to go digital, that's fine, and put questions in the chat. Oh my gosh, someone's saying they think I'm their neighbor. I'm just looking in the chat. Okay, I don't know. Maybe a while ago. Okay, so try putting yourself in the shoes of a younger learner. What might they be curious about? What might they want to know more about? So I'm going to be reading just a piece of this story, and I want you to just put yourself in the shoes of one of your young learners, perhaps in your own classroom, and just to think about very loosely what you might think about if you're reading this story. Okay, so, but I also want to, so when we start out stories in the Ghanaian context, the storyteller will say, Gatnan ku, and then the children will respond, Tazo Mujita, we are all ears, hence the title of my talk. So I thought I would just play a quick clip of some students saying this from Ghana to kind of transport you there. Say it louder, say it louder. Okay, so I'm not sure that we could really kind of beat them out here, so we'll just start reading the story. Okay. Not so very long ago, many animals lived in the Zongo Lagoon. Fish basked in the clear, clean waters, frogs sang in the tall green grasses, lizards scurried up and down the trunks of leafy moringa trees. And down by the watery edge of the peaceful lagoon that flowed into the sea lived 3 best friends, crab, tortoise, and spider. A fisherman by trade, Crab was generous and hardworking. He spent most of his time at the bottom of the lagoon with his family or hauling fish into his canoe. Tortoise was wise and patient. Animals came to him for advice and to buy the medicines he made from healing roots and leaves. Despite their differences, Crab, Tortoise, and Spider ate dinner together every day at high tide. Crab caught the fish, Tortoise blessed the kenke, and Spider ate greedily. Unlike the other 2, Spider was lazy and selfish. When he wasn't lounging around in his favorite moringa tree overlooking the lagoon, he mined for gold upstream. One day, after dinner, instead of throwing his rubbish into the dustbin, Spider tossed his kenke leaves and plantain peels right into the lagoon. Okay, so I'm going to have to leave you on that cliffhanger because I don't have time to read the whole story. But I think it's interesting to kind of just sort of generally think about the power of storytelling and of this story in particular and what students might be able to learn from it. And we will come back to that later. But right now I want to actually step back and think about this first question. So understanding a sense of place, and how might thinking about a sense of place be useful in teaching and learning? So one of my all-time favorite anthropologists is Keith Basso. And he talks a lot about sensing place and the relationships that we have to places. And he writes, places we realize are as much a part of us as we are part of them. And senses of place, yours, mine, and everyone else's partake complexly of both. And so we can see how we are very much kind of reflections of the places that we live in, that it takes long periods of time to really get to know a place deeply. And that when you do, they hold deep, deep meanings for us. So even just thinking back to this story, Gizo Gizo, we can see about all of the different kinds of relationships and attachments that these characters were creating with their sense of place. So for instance, Crab connecting with the lagoon and collecting the fish for his family. We can think about Tortoise and his relationship to these herbal remedies, and that in turn is a relationship to the environment around him. We can think of Spider and his relationship to the moringa tree, and then we can think of, all of the characters working together and their attachments even to eating food together at high tide. Okay, so as wonderful it is kind of stepping back and thinking about a sense of place, I think it's also really helpful to think about it from your own personal experience. And so what I would like you to do, again, on your piece of paper or in the chat, think about a place that you feel attached to and just write down 4 to 6 words or phrases that describe that place. I'll just give you a minute or so. Anyone want to share a place that just kind of immediately popped into mind? Everyone's quiet. Warm, sunny seaside sand. Okay, that's great. Yeah. So I'm assuming this person spent a lot of time on the beach, perhaps.
Sweet, warm ground blue.
Okay, wow, lovely. And where is that place that you described, Elsa?
That is Mauritius.
Okay, of course, yeah. The warm air and gentle morning breeze that carries bird sounds and the awakening of nature. Lovely, it's really nice. And I'm sure that all of these words that you're describing these places with, that they're attached to a particular place probably that has deep meaning to you personally, maybe to you and your family or friends that you have spent time in. So we can see how, we can imagine how in bringing in a sense of place that actually can really be transformative in education too, right? And if we're drawing from our own personal experiences, if our students are able to draw on, yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. For some reason on my screen, I see 2 black squares, I think where your windows are covering your image.
Oh, okay. So can I close them?
Yes.
Like, is that better?
That's better for me.
Okay,
sorry to interrupt.
So it's the chat, I guess, that just,
yes,
I want to be able to see the chat. Okay.
It blanks it out, but
okay. Sorry about that. That's too bad. So it might be hard for me to then look at the chat while we're.
This is much better because now we can see your total picture.
Okay, sorry about
thank
that.
you so much.
Okay, Zoom. Can't wait to do this in person. Okay, so personal meanings is one way, right, in which we can kind of create and understand the sense of place, and it creates more meaning for students if they're able to kind of think about their own experiences and places that have meaning for them, and then think about how topics in STEAM, for instance, can kind of interact with those places and how you make meaning out of them. But then in addition, we can think about the cultural context as well, right? And so even though it's really important to kind of draw from and get a sense of how we make meaning out of places that we know really well, there also might be places that we don't know as well. So for instance, this African market. And so how do we kind of connect those places that we know really well to those that we might know much less? And how we can actually kind of widen our understanding of a sense of place to include these other places. So for example, this is just an example that I like. It's quite simple, but if we're looking at this stack of oranges in Ghana, West Africa, in a market, they're stacked in a very particular way. Perhaps it might seem a little unusual, might seem foreign, unfamiliar to you. There are some kind of oranges strewn on the ground too, which is quite different from, let's say, going into Whole Foods or Wegmans or something like that and seeing a very different way in which these oranges are presented, right? So we can start to think about the different values and beliefs and ways in which we make meaning out of these places, and how even if, let's say, our subject matter happens to be maybe the science of oranges, that if we're looking at that in different places, it takes on very different meaning to the inhabitants of those places. So I would suggest that kind of mooring these ideas in place is really important, not only culturally, but then also environmentally. So again, if we're looking at simple example, science of oranges, that oranges, even if they are oranges everywhere, kind of in abstract terms, that they take on because of the context in which they are located, in which they are grown, in which they are harvested, the local conditions, whether there are certain chemicals or toxins, or however these oranges are interacting with their environment, that we need to take that into account. And so I think that that's really another way in which sense of place can come in here. And so in sum, I just want to suggest that sense of place it helps students, it's more relatable because we can connect the topic to our own experiences. It's more connective because it helps us see how to connect our own experiences with the topic to other experiences and understandings. And then it's also diverse because it encourages us to look at how environmental conditions change depending upon where you are in the world. Okay, so I want to just pause one more time here and just ask, how might you consider incorporating a sense of place in your teaching? So again, you can just jot down any thoughts that you might have, whether it's in the chat or on your paper. Okay, so let's keep going. So now I want to move to the second part of my talk, which is really building on the first, building on a sense of place, which is engaging in storytelling. So we have, right, these very diverse, diffuse experiences, but then how do we make sense of them? And one way in which we can do this is storytelling, to create kind of outlines, right, of this experience that otherwise is basically kind of almost impossible to tell in its full, right? So how can we use storytelling as a vital teaching and learning tool in the classroom? So first, a question that I like to ask my students is, why do we tell stories? This is great. I'm seeing some things in the chat here. I want to keep going, but please read what each of you is writing. So why do we tell stories? Does anyone want to either unmute themselves and suggest why we tell stories, or you feel free to put it in the chat too? Any thoughts? My students certainly have some thoughts that they will share with you in a minute. Okay, for memory, connection, groundedness, social bonding, garnering interest, pleasure, moral instruction. Great. Okay, these are fantastic. Yeah, so these are just a few. I think a lot of you are getting at some of the same ideas that my students were talking about. So here are just a few quotes. I'm not going to read them all, but I'll read the first couple. Stories give us knowledge and understanding. We tell stories because they make us do the right thing. Stories help us acquire imaginations. And then, they can give you a sense of direction. So stories help us remember where we come from and where we are going. And then actually, I'll read this one too, confidence. Stories help us learn so that we can do something great in the future. Reading and writing stories makes us confident. Stories can strengthen us. Give direction. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of really wonderful comments in the chat. Thank you. Okay, so another way that I've often thought about stories is kind of the roundness of storytelling. And I think Nigerian novelist Ben Okri says it quite well. He says, "There's nothing that expresses the roundedness of human beings more than storytelling. Stories are the highest technology of being." And so the roundness of storytelling, I think, which is what most of us are getting at here with a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to the meaning of stories. And so we can think about it, or at least I've thought about it, this roundness in kind of two dimensions. So one of them is sort of the roundness of content. And I often have used the metaphor for soup to think about a story. So thinking about all of these different ingredients that go into making a soup and that go into making a story, and that the result, the soup, is definitely, it's almost more rich, more overflowing than each of those ingredients on their own. And so we can think about all of the different pieces that go into the making of a story. So here are some examples that are very simple terms: order, problem, setting, character, moral, things that you can put into your story soup, but then you can also add, of course, personal twists, secret ingredients to make your soup extra delicious. And then another dimension of kind of the roundness of storytelling is the roundness of the learning process itself. which I think too many of you were getting at when you're talking about the meaning of stories to use. So when my co-founder and I, John Shadler, founded the Zongo Story Project, we were really thinking about this kind of holistic way that storytelling can both it encourages critical thinking and creativity through play, that it can promote local knowledge building and sense of place, and then it can elevate oral, written, and visual forms of literacy, what I think often now is called inclusive literacy. So the roundedness in that it's interdisciplinary, it's sort of holistic in the ways in which you learn. And so what I would like to do for the remaining of the presentation is thinking about how we went about making Gizo Gizo, and then how that kind of turned into the Zongo Story Project in a way, and to give you some kind of more tangible ways in which you might think about incorporating storytelling into your own practices as well. Okay, but first we need to travel to Ghana. So here we go, off in a rocket ship that a student made, and landing in busy Accra, just to give you a sense of what that looks like, and traveling west towards Cape Coast in a trotro, which is a large van. You can see some of the fish maybe that the students could have drawn from the book Gizo Gizo. You can see kenke, which is a food that is also in the story, that's fermented corn wrapped in banana husks, or sorry, corn husks or banana leaves. And then the fishing boats, perhaps like the one that Crab was fishing from, and a net. And then the slave castles as well that are quite well known in Cape Coast. Okay, and here we are arriving in the Zongo, the stranger settlement, and bus stop Zongo. Now we're inside, so you can kind of get a sense of what that landscape looks like, what it feels like, what the water systems are like. So there are open drains, a lot of collection of water through individual buckets. And then this is where we held most of our storytelling classes in the very beginning. It's called Madrasa Alley. And so I would like to, so first, when we started thinking, when I went there, I had no idea what we were going to be doing. I really wanted to involve students in a project about water. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I can do this through storytelling. I really had no kind of longer term agenda in place at this point. So I started with free writing, reading, and drawing, just to give students a chance to kind of explore storytelling on their own and possibly relate it to the topic at hand, which was water sanitation, water conservation, but I even left it more open than that. I wanted students to feel free to draw from their own experiences. So some of them chose to write, some of them chose to draw. And then later on, when we applied a lot of this to the Zongo Story Project, students would also read. But really it was about, interpersonal exchange. We would walk around as teachers and help the students if they were struggling over an idea, or if they're inspired and just wanted to share something with you personally. And then students also really loved sharing with the rest of the class what they had done on their own. So there was a lot of, a student would stand up and feel really good about sharing what they had written. And then if students didn't feel comfortable or didn't really know what to write about, we also started something called ZSP Takeoff. So we would ask questions like, why are stories important? Or why do we tell stories? Or think about a story that you loved and that you would want to write about. And then they would just have some kind of idea to start with that would get their imagination and ideas flowing. And so here are some other examples. We ended up creating some activity sheets, and I have a whole bunch of these, so I'm more than happy to share these later on. And I think actually a number of them are already posted to the website, but more than happy to share. But here are just a few examples when we did create ZSP Takeoff sheets. So the students could write about, tell a story about a picture, through writing or through drawing or both. And then sometimes we would even put out objects onto the table, and then students could pick up those objects, like, I don't know, I have hand sanitizer here, and as an example, and might kind of, touch and feel, smell the hand sanitizer and create a story out of it from there. So starting from really sort of visceral experiences, or tangible objects to be able to make meaningful stories out of them. Okay, so again, you can kind of think about, okay, what sorts of objects or how might I incorporate these kinds of ideas into my own practices? And then another dimension to creating Gizo was listening to stories. And so we would listen to each other's stories. The students often loved telling stories that their grandparents and great-grandparents had told them through the years. We would have storytellers actually come in and share their own stories, which was really wonderful. Oftentimes it was parents of the kids who would come in. I would also share stories from lots of different cultures, so the United States, but then also stories that from local authors, which was really meaningful. And oftentimes we would use them as kind of an entree into a particular topic. So this week we were talking about emotions. So there was a book about emotions, and then we had some guest speakers come in and who are actually artists from the local Zongo community to talk about emotions and to help students figure out how to draw them. And so again, here are some examples of some activity sheets that were related to that. So draw and write about a story you listened to in class, draw and write about a story you remember well. So again, this just kind of gets students thinking about the topic at hand. So you could imagine, for instance, if it was STEAM-based, what the subject matter of that story might be, and then how students might actually take that further through storytelling. Okay, so here I just want to take a minute. I know we're short on time, but write down an idea for how you might incorporate storytelling in your classroom. Just to get you thinking about this a little bit. Okay, sorry, that wasn't very much time, but I want to make sure we can get, okay, take your time. Okay, great. Okay, so let's move on to problem though, which is another element to story soup. Okay, I'm just seeing Joy Keanu begin with, did you know? Yes, that is excellent, absolutely. Did you know? Perfect, or what if? Which is also a good one. That's great. Okay, so then we can also enter into thinking about a story through problem. And in fact, this is actually how Gizo began. And there was a little boy who raised his hand and he said, I just have to say Habiba. Habiba is my name in Arabic and Hausa. He said, my family has really been struggling finding water. There were 2 weeks where we couldn't actually get clean water because there were these miners who were polluting the river and we are downriver. And so all of our water was too dirty, too unsanitary to drink. And so then all of a sudden, all of these other students started chiming in and were saying that they too have had similar experiences. And we decided at that point, why not? Let's write a collaborative story based upon this particular problem. So you can see here the mining industry in Ghana, and then the eventual illustration that came out of it. Again, that's a collaboration between myself and students. So here, again, are just some quick examples thinking about the problem and how you might actually start to consider a particular story just based on maybe it's an environmental problem, any kind of problem that you could possibly imagine, any sort of puzzle, right, that's in your discipline, and thinking about how you might kind of create a story out of that. And then here, students kind of puzzling over their own problem, getting ready for a performance. Okay, so again, let's take a pause. So how might you use the storytelling ingredient problem in your own classroom? So you could think of, for example, a problem that has something to do with a topic maybe that you're studying right now in class even, or a puzzle. I use the word problem because it was the easiest one for students in Ghana to understand, but I actually like the word puzzle a little bit better. Okay, an engineering project, great. And our new students are concerned about high voltage power stations, great. So you could write a story about that, excellent. Oh, these are really interesting. Okay. So then a third element to our story soup is place. And obviously place and problem are very much interconnected, as we already learned from, a sense of place. We're all intertwined with the places that we live in. But we started looking very closely at the places around us when we were creating Gizo Gizo. We paid attention to what we smelled, what we heard. We would touch the clothing on the clothesline. We would look at the differences between, for example, what it felt like to be in a home, and then what it felt like to be in a more public space, and how those spaces were used, and how we might kind of incorporate those ideas into the story itself. We also looked at, the wider physical environment, and we might actually even listen to an environment rather than seeing it, and write down and draw what we would hear. So here's an example. And so students might actually not even see this image, but might just draw what they're hearing. And so again, that's sort of a different way into thinking about the learning process. In addition, with place, we would look at how places change over time. So we were thinking about, what happens in the rainy season, what happens in the dry season, what does that look like, what does that feel like? Students would also look at representations of places if we couldn't actually go to the places themselves, and come up with a story based upon that particular place or an activity that was happening in it. And then here are just a couple other examples of activity sheets. So draw a place in your story. Again, here we incorporate, how do you feel in this place? What do you hear? What do you smell in this place? And then also another way we would think about it is zooming in and zooming out. So if you got really close to an object or really far away, what kinds of things might you observe? And how does that sort of change your point of view about the object or material that you are learning about? Yes, I love that idea of interviewing other family members about the place. That's another really wonderful way into getting to know the meaning of a place, and kind of a deeper sense of it, so that you can write a meaningful story. So then how might you use the storytelling ingredient place in your classroom? It seems like some of you have already been starting to think about this, but then just take a minute again and write down or think about how you might use storytelling ingredient place. How might you start from place and create a story? Okay, let's move on to the next ingredient, which is character, which happens to be my favorite, perhaps because we are all humans after all. But when first starting to look at Gizo Gizo and thinking about, so we had the problem, we had the place, but we didn't really have the characters, and we didn't necessarily want them to be humans, but we certainly considered it. So here are a number of possibilities that we started coming up with. These are just a few of thousands of characters that we created. And then we finally landed on the crab, the tortoise, and the spider. And in part, we were drawn upon the ways in which we could represent them using these sort of local fabrics and symbols, and use them both in representations of the landscape in the story, but then also their coloring. And then we explored these characters through actually kind of creating masks and creating performances out of them, so that we could really embody the characters and try to get a sense of how they might actually interact with one another. So you can see here, these are kind of other iterations of tortoise, spider, and crab, but they're sort of testing on these personalities of these characters and seeing how they felt and what might be missing, what we needed to add into the story. And then here are the three characters that we ended up with. And then again, here are just a couple of sample sheets, so you can get a sense of a couple of ways at least that you might think about how students could start a story through character, or add it onto a problem afterwards. So about my character, and then this is actually one of my favorites. It's very simple, but one character meets another, For example, if a beautiful bird meets a jealous cow, what do you think would happen? So immediately there's some conflict there, and that actually in itself kind of generates a problem or a puzzle, right? So what is going to happen there when they interact? And I think that that's a really wonderful way to start out thinking about a story. So again, how might you use the storytelling ingredient character in your own classroom? So again, you can think about this. One way that I was actually thinking about it is you could even do a role play where if, I don't know, let's say you're looking at water pollution and you have different characters from different parts of the city. So you might have a tourist, you might have a resident, you might have a scientist, all of these different people, and how they might kind of respond to a particular issue in different ways. And they could actually role play these characters and sort of maybe perhaps even try to come to some agreement and create a story out of that. Okay, and so then putting it all together, this one we can go through quickly, but we are often inspired by performances and thinking about the ways problem, character, and place come together through performance. Here we are preparing for a performance. We often had local guests, so coming in to show us how these things might how these different elements of the story might come together. We looked at the sequencing of the story and drew various sequences, how characters kind of changed over the course of the story. And then again, here are a couple of examples of, how we started kind of bringing it together into a soup. So you can imagine, what if kinds of questions again, which I find really helpful. And then you could also think about telling a story using order. So what happens first, what happens second, what's sort of the disruption or problem that occurs in the middle of the story, and then how is it resolved? Okay, and then finally, serving your story soup, right? So we served our story soup in a number of ways. So this was a poster of Gizo Gizo when we presented it to the community through performance. These are a couple of men looking on, a child presenting the story itself, and then also talking about the moral of the story and what we might actually do to resolve some of these issues in the community. This was when the book was actually published, and a student is exhibiting our work very proudly. And then a student here too is pointing out, she was actually the one who worked on the fish on the bottom there. And so she was very proud of that and wanted to show us. But all the students received copies of the book. And then later through the Zongo Story Project, we created playbooks so students could actually do these activities in their own homes if they weren't able to go to the Library of Congress. And then we also created a collection or an anthology, we're still working on it, of short stories that students did on their own. And that also is available online, I believe. And if it's not there for some reason, then I'm more than happy to send you a copy. But it's fun, you can kind of get a sense of what these students are imagining and the experiences, personal experiences that they're drawing upon. This is at the end of one of our sessions. And so there we have it. So I hope this was helpful, a little bit inspiring, and that it helped us sort of start at least to kind of brainstorm and think about the importance of both a sense of place and of storytelling in our own classrooms. And I just want to end actually with a question about sort of a what if, I guess, and the possibility of potentially creating some kind of partnership, a literary exchange between young learners in the United States and in Ghana. And if any of you are interested in something like that, then please reach out to us at africa@bu, whoops, not .edu, just .edu, because we would love to talk to you about what some kind of partnership might look like. And I did add in those other lines because I realized that not all of you are coming from the United States today. So this doesn't have to necessarily be a partnership from the US to Ghana. It could be, obviously a much more complex sort of network, but ways in which we could possibly exchange stories, exchange understandings about the world, and especially as kind of grounded in our own experiences, but then also reaching out and kind of connecting to other people's experiences. Great, so that's it. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, I'm I'll stop that. Okay. I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Emily. This was so thought-provoking and really engaging the story as connective tissue in some ways. Story as the connective tissue to our sense of place and bringing our connection to place and our meaning making with place. So please, there's already a couple questions and comments in the chat box that I know you've taken, Emily. Some thank yous. Joy had the suggestion of you could also work the story backwards so that the kids can identify the different ingredients in their story soup too.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And the whole listening to a story, you could, I mean, it doesn't have to be the story, any story, and picking out the various ingredients, and then kind of, you can almost create a lesson plan then, right? Or have a week or 3-week lesson plan with each of those ingredients. But obviously focused on, whatever learning material you're looking at that week.
Yeah, lots of wonderful celebratory comments around these amazing tools, and comments around really the importance of engaging our children through the local stories and sense of place. So thank you. Anybody wants to add any questions to Emily? We have time for maybe one or two. Great. Well, thank you so much, Emily. Again, Brenda Randolph, who is our collaborator at and our partner at Howard University, linked the wonderful reading of Young Readers Center at the Library of Congress that Emily so beautifully led a few years ago in 2017 when you won the CABA Award. So that's worth checking out. It's that same link is also on our resource list. And thank you for all the tools that you've presented to us with it, full of metaphors and exciting ways to think about place and engaging ourselves in it. So, so thank you, Emily. Great. So now we are going to turn to our last but not least story, which also connects directly to placemaking and sense making us out of place. And Susan is going to lead us in the story of teaching place, the Niger River Delta as a nexus of cities and trade.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was just absolutely wonderful. And I am going to round out our day here before we have a sort of general discussion with with sort of a hobby horse of mine, as I myself have been on a learning journey about the history of West Africa. It's never been taught well, as we've been, so that's sort of sub-theme for this whole day. But the idea of the Niger River Delta, the idea of West African society is so often taught in terms of empires and in terms of, the great man, whether it's Mansa Musa or Sundiata or whatever, and not to dismiss either of those things, but what about the place? What about that place where that emerged? And so especially we talk about the cities that were there. We talk about the centers of learning. We talk about the trade, and particularly this kind of blind way of teaching about the gold salt trade, as if it just is sort of, a cartoon of what trade was like. And without understanding a clear sense of place, none of that makes any sense. So let us start then just with, again, this is a PowerPoint, and it has the sort of slides and references that you can use here. So the Niger River is very unique. It is rainbow shaped. Everybody can relate to that. And looking at this map of the geography of Africa, you can see that that of the 3 major or 4 major zones that are talked about in African geography of the continent of Africa's geography, 3 of them are represented here: the Sahara Desert, the Sahel, or this grasslands, and then the sort of forested areas. And so you can see how the Niger River traverses all of them. And its course runs in an arc from the behind the Atlantic Ocean up to the Sahara, and then flows back down into the Gulf of Guinea and the Atlantic Ocean. What's really unique about that, and I'll flip back up to the slides, is this area, which is called the Niger Bend, which is a heart of the civilizations of West Africa and of its cities. And so what is there is the unusual factor that the Niger River has an internal delta as well as a delta at its mouth in what is today Nigeria. This is a satellite picture of it, two different satellite images of this delta, which of course would occur during the rainy seasons. It's a place of savanna, having hot, wet and dry seasons. So for millennia, the river has been the most important water supply in the Western Sahara Desert. It makes its way to the ancient city of Timbuktu and many other cities further downstream and upstream. These areas are regularly flooded by water from the Niger, allowing crops to be grown in the area as the floodwater recedes. During the rainy season from July to October, this inland Niger Delta gleams like a giant emerald in the arid African Sahel. This inland delta grows to some 20,000 square kilometers during the 4-month rainy season that begins each July. And during the dry season, it can shrink to roughly 3,900 kilometers. Here is another satellite image which shows up here. I'm going to run my cursor up here onto the city of Timbuktu, and it is related to the Niger by it's actually its own port along this area that is called Kabara and is near the arc of the Niger River. So this NASA satellite image of Timbuktu shows vegetation in red, water in blue, and human-built structures in brown gray. This, of course, is a modern image because it's a satellite image. The course of the river may have shifted over time. You can sort of see the shadows here where it might have been much closer to Timbuktu in earlier times. So the Niger, the land south of the city changes dramatically as the river flows from west to east in a network of braided stream channels with waterways branching out from the main river. It passes through diverse environmental conditions on its route from its source in Guinea, where rainfall averages 2,300 millimeters per year and to less than 250 millimeters during the dry season, where again that contrasts with later. So what does that enable? It enables a place where cities could appear, where agriculture was, and where there was a need for both trade and for a particular item that is, again, gets back to our science. During the millions of years that the Niger has brought water and sediment into the desert, the river and delta have changed, but created a sustainable environment for herding, fishing, farming, and transportation that would be reliable. So now we come finally to what is often the starting point of the story, this gold salt trade. But when we place that in the geographic nexus, we can find out that the gold fields lay upstream near the source of the Niger River, and it could be carried out in dugout pirogues to the cities of the Niger Bend. And we'll see an example of one shortly. So you had the ingredients of place, the gold fields in this forested area near the source of the Nile, and you had during the rainy season enough water that made the river reliably navigable all the way up to the edge. In the Sahara Desert, also on the other side here, lay the salt deposits from ancient seas where slabs of salt could be mined and carried to the Niger Bend cities by camel caravan. Now, there are a couple of articles here about that. So the gold salt trade doesn't just come out of nowhere. It doesn't just, appear as this sort of silent trade or whatever it happens to have been, but rather has a firm place in the geographic nexus. And what comes out of that is the trading cities of the Niger Bend, which were the jewels of West African empires. And here are just a few of them named and a few of the various images. That, by the way, is an absolutely beautiful pirogue or dugout canoe that is shown, I believe, at the city of Gao or somewhere like that. But in any case, what this does is it takes us to a whole different context of what happened to those cities. It wasn't the great man who created the cities. It wasn't the empires that created the cities. It was the geographic nexus that created the cities. And when you go back to this slide about fishing, if you were to be in a society that had enormous amounts of fish arriving at a certain time of year, what would you need to make the best use of that bounty of protein? What is the one thing you would need? You can write it in the chat. It's got 4 letters and starts with an S. I don't know if Elsa could manage, but obviously it's salt. And if you had an item to trade with that extremely valuable commodity that could ensure the nutrition of people year round. It could ensure trade. To have a commodity that could be traded like that for, something which seems to be in the sort of paradox of value, salt versus gold, one being quite cheap, the other being insanely valuable, you now have some reasonable sense. And if you add to that the idea of herders and farmers trading at this Niger Bend during certain times of the year would be like, I've got the meat, you've got the bread. We're making a sandwich. And then you add to this whole area the kind of trade, and then when you come to thinking of the cultural transmissions, the learning, the fabrics, the textiles, all of these things that came to be traded once there was a nexus of cities. And when we look at the idea of the empires, it fits in. Yes, certainly it does. But it isn't the reason for being of those cities. Rather, these cities were sustained over time with the coming and going of empires. And those leaders, those great rulers, had to say please and thank you, because those cities were so deeply rooted in this region. And they were indigenous African cities, and they had their own character, and they were diverse in terms of the people who came there. And there are wonderful stories about the various people who migrated to those cities and their contributions to those places. So again, there are some more references. And by the way, I restored the last slide that somehow went missing in my my iron presentation. So I want to thank you. That was probably a bit more than 5 minutes, but it's just a hobby horse I have about how we really must recontextualize the way we teach about West African history.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you for bringing us to this very particular region of the world, again, in thinking about how science is a story of people in places. Like I said in the beginning, it's a sense making of people in places. And if we forget that link, that connective tissue, then we are missing a whole lot of context and a whole lot of, and we're hovering above what actually is an incredibly grounded discipline. Again, I want to thank everybody here for coming. Thank you for coming on a Saturday. You stayed until 1:30 p.m. on East Coast time. So that is really something really important to that it shows your commitment to this kind of work. And I want to thank all of the presenters, that really from all the presenters who delivered their presentation live, the adults, but also all the children who participated in it, and the teachers who collaborated. It really was a wonderful to hear your perspectives. And I want to thank Susan from Georgetown University for collaborating on this, in particular, Emily from the Zongo Story Project, Thierry from Gamma Institute, to have made this event what it was today. So much appreciation, and enjoy your Saturday. And until the next time, I do want to say, mark your calendars, because on November 13th, the African Studies Association Outreach Council is hosting a day-long workshop. It is free for teachers, and it is a collaboration between all of the Africa-based national resource centers, just as Boston University is. So November 13th for the ASA, and we will link this now, and hope to see you there, and look forward to getting your feedback on the evaluation.